Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have the power of public unions, a concentrated organized interest captured the public institutions meant to constrain it in a way that imposes cost on a diffuse counterparty without meaningful political resistance, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said from liberalism.org, the structural setup of public sector unionism is different from private sector unionism in two specific and consequential ways. The first difference is on the union side. A private sector union bargains with a counterparty, the corporation's management, whose election it does not finance and whose tenure it cannot directly affect. A public sector union bargains with a counterparty, a state legislator, a city council member, a school board member, whose campaign is often funded. A counterparty in that position has weaker reasons than a normal employer to drive a hard bargain and stronger reasons to please the people sitting outside. The second difference is on the government side. A private employer who agrees to a generous contract feels like the consequences from firm revenue, share price, and maybe in personal compensation. The negotiator either has equity at stake or reports to people who do. A public sector negotiator faces none of these incentives. The money committed to wages, benefits, and pensions is not the negotiator's money, it's taxpayers. The state's incentive structure titles systematically toward giving in. The point is structural. Public sector unions exhibit, with unusual clarity, the core liberal concern, a concentrated organized interest that has captured public institutions meant to constrain it in a way that imposes cost on a diffuse counterparty without meaningful political resistance. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for unions, be they private sector or public sector, but I think the libertarian position, if workers want to form a union, they should be able to, but ultimately, if the management doesn't like that, they should be able to voice their concerns about that as well. Ultimately, it comes down to, what people are willing to justify when it comes to the use of their labor. And if people want, as I said, if workers want form unions, they should be able to. But ultimately, I do think unions a lot of the time are going to be corrupt and inefficient, and that's true of whether they're private sector or public sector. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have evidence destroyed or lost in death of ICE detonee that was ruled a homicide from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the government can get away with destroying whatever evidence it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they're in a position of state authority, and people are always going to act in their own self-interest, and that includes the state. I think that's very important to remember as well, When it comes to the state, everyone's going to act in their own self-interest, and the state's not going to be an exception to that, despite people wanting to think so. That's just not human nature. Human nature, people are always going to act in their own self-interest. And next we have Trump's $100,000 H-1B visa fee is an unconstitutional tax, a federal judge rules, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And I would say all taxes are unconstitutional to some degree because, ultimately taxation is going to be inherently theft. And, if people want to pay taxes, they should be able to, but, they shouldn't be forced to pay taxes if they don't want to. And, ultimately, I think the other problem here is that we have H-1B visas at all. I think if the government does want to impose immigration restrictions for stuff like H-1B visas, they should be able to. But I do think, you can make the argument that they go against freedom of movement as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Russia revives Soviet-era controls to police women's bodies and futures, coming to a conservative country near you, from United24Media.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But Russia has always been the woke boogeyman for forever. It seems like they're shifting over to Israel, which I think is probably a better boogeyman than Russia. But ultimately, if Russia wants to justify whatever it wants to justify, ultimately, Russia is a very authoritarian government, and even more authoritarian than a lot of other countries like the U.S. And oftentimes, there's not going to be anything you can do about it. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have America is Finished, and Here is Why, posted by the Dowcast, and that's a cross post from the TrueAnon subreddit, and that looks like a video they did on YouTube from Anthony M. Calling down fire from heaven, escalation against the U.S. to occur between September 27, 2026 and June 12, 2027. And yeah, that seems like, I think they posted something like this earlier, about how this astrology says that the U.S. is doomed in the future. But ultimately, if you want to think that the stars say America is doomed, I think you should be able to. But when you're saying America is finished every single day, eventually people are gonna get numb to it all. It's kind of like when you say Orange Man bad. You've been saying Orange Man bad for 4,000 plus days now. Eventually, people are just gonna get numb to it all. Next, we have DHS says it is zero tolerance for verbal assaults. Here's what the law says from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think, if you want to verbally assault someone in a position of government authority, you should be able to. But, ultimately, it doesn't really matter what the law says. It matters how they're enforced. And since someone in a position of state authority can justify doing pretty much whatever they want to, and, since the state controls the courts and legal system as well, they're oftentimes not going to be held accountable. It's just going to show you that, you probably shouldn't do that. But, ultimately, if you want to do that, that's fine. But I personally think that's just kind of asking for trouble. But ultimately, justify whatever you want to. Next, we have more sable rattling by the quote-unquote peace president, posted by Jai Porcupine, and that looks like a screenshot of a tweet from Donald Trump. Iran's military is in complete and total mess. Much of it, like their Navy and Air Force, doesn't even exist anymore. They have been completely defeated. Iran is all talk and no action. The bully of the Middle East is dead. They've taken too long to negotiate a deal that would have been too great for them. Now they will have to pay the price. President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump's constant saber-rattling on Iran, but, in many ways, he's just edgy towards W. Bush. But it's not going to be different when the Democrats take power. Look at Obama in Libya or Biden in Syria. The U.S. is always going to get involved in the foreign countries' affairs, regardless of which branch of the uniparty is in power. I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have the wet dream of every Christian fruitcake, no separation of church and state, posted by Donald Key, and that's a crosspost from the Christian religious fruitcake subreddit. And I guess that's a clip of a guy saying the Constitution is written only about like how the Constitution says we should have religion in the government. I guess, I don't know. But, ultimately, I do think, the church and state should be separate. But, ultimately, ideology is going to motivate everyone when it comes to their what they want to justify, and that does include religious ideology. The difference between the right and the left, I would say, is the right, they're at least open that they're run by a religious ideology in Christianity. The left would never don't say that, even though they are very much motivated by a religious ideology and wokeism, which they'll say, oh, that's not a religious ideology, but it pretty much has all the markings of one, even if they're not going to call it one. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, has anyone kept up to date with the Carmelo Anthony case in Texas? What's the Libertarian view on it? Posted by Important Valuable 36, and that's across what they did from the ANCAP 101 subreddit, and they said, so I don't normally watch every criminal case all the time, but this one caught my attention pretty well. I've kept myself educated, knowing most cases that went down similar to this, but part of me thinks this could be one of the government's corruption at its finest, where obviously the judge who ran this case is friends with Austin Metcalf's dad, and which I'm not surprise, doesn't shock me. What's the Libertarian viewpoint when it comes to this case? If Carmelo was the assailant trying to claim self-defense, but the evidence shows he made the crime, does that justify using deadly force to apply the death penalty to him in a stateless society? Or does it better align with legal entities, courts, and justice systems to fairly administer vigilante punishment? I truly believe government judicial systems are broken, monopolized cabal cartel rings that can do whatever they want, justify biasing sentencing for suspects who could have been innocent and denied fair trial. When it comes to Carmelo, I don't think he's innocent, but the main issue here is Austin stabbing friends with the judge makes the case extremely fraudulent. Many people have a huge problem with it. I'm not going to play the racial card here, but regardless of ethnicity or creed, if you run political office, especially as a sitting judge enforcing judicial decisions, you should be punished for bias, especially if you know someone you are friends with someone with them. Such relationships can easily influence legal decisions and create bias from a judge's mindset. Overall, I'm not surprised Carmelo is getting what he deserves, but that's the only issue I want to address. Has anyone ever had similar concerns about that court case or trial? And yeah, personally, I do think, ultimately, I do think it's kind of shifty that, the judge was friends with the dad. But regardless, Carmelo was pretty much 100% guilty. Of course, Reddit, there are going to be some resistance on that because Reddit thinks that the darker skin you have, the more you should be, you should pretty much be enabled. You should pretty much be get off scot-free to label lighter skin people with immunity. But sadly, that's not how the world works. The world works, regardless of your skin color. If you violate the NAP, you should be held accountable. And it doesn't matter if you have dark skin or light skin. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Illinois just adopted a half-baked scheme to tax social media from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But Reddit loves taxes when it comes to a lot to the funding whatever progressive bullshit they like. But they suddenly hate taxes when they go against the narrative. So ultimately, I don't think the government should be taxing social media, but I don't think the government should be taxing anything. Ultimately, the government's in a position of authority to tax whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they have the force of the state on their side. Next, we have American politician fakes a phone call for roughly 90 seconds to avoid questions about possible Social Security cuts, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Mayor McCheese subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the Libertarian position on Social Security, is we shouldn't have Social Security. If people want to fund it through voluntary taxation, they should be able to. But ultimately, Social Security is just a government-run Ponzi scheme, and I think that's important to remember as well. If an individual group did Social Security, it'd be 100% labeled as a Ponzi scheme, and they'd all be sent to prison for it. But the state can do it, and it's just the law. And I think that's just pirates and emperors. When the individual does it, it's a crime, but when the state does it, it's just the law. Next, we have inflation rate is 4.2% as prices outpace paychecks from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but inflation was horrible under Biden as well, and Reddit didn't care. The Reddit only cares now since the out-group is in power rather than the in-group. Next, we have In Today's News, posted by Ragnarok KXG, and that's a meme from Jimmy Neutron. It's Donald Trump's face over Sheen's body, and it says, "This is U.S. victory in Iran." And then Miss Fowler says, "Trump, this is the 7th week in a row you've claimed victory in Iran." And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump constantly declaring victory in Iran. But ultimately, if he wants to say we've won in Iran 50,000 times, he should be able to. That's freedom of speech. But regardless, just because a politician says something doesn't necessarily make it true. I think that's important to remember as well. Just because someone says something doesn't make it true. And that's pretty much true for everyone, regardless of their stature or how much money or views they have. Next, we have How Did the Libertarian Party Go From Embracing Trump to Trying to DeMAGA Itself, posted by Donald Key, and that's a crosspost from the Political Discussion subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't, I think a lot of Libertarian Party members did justify going for Trump in 2024 as the lesser of two evils, but I think, it's important to remember that the lesser of two evils is still an evil. But regardless, I don't think it really matters. I'm in the camp that if voting really matters, they wouldn't let us do it. If you want to justify going for Trump or Harris in 2024, justify whatever you want to. But, ultimately, you can't vote yourself free, and the American electoral system is very much proof of that. And I think the libertarian position is we should try and get rid of all elections and let people run themselves rather than have a cabal of elites rule over them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Rep. Kamliger. Dove sounds the alarm about the national security threat of Donald Trump's sleeping habits, saying we cannot trust the White House on matters concerning the president's health because they are denying what Americans are seeing with their own two eyes, posted by Donald Key, and that's a crosspost from the Underreported News subreddit. And yeah, I think it's interesting. Reddit was completely fine when Joe Biden was sleeping on the job, but now that Donald Trump's pulling a dozy don, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. No values, only teams. That's very much how Reddit works, because they made excuses for Joe Biden's senility for his whole term, but suddenly, when Trump starts acting senile, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. Just go to show you they have no principles whatsoever. They only Democrat good, Republican bad. Next, we have Postal Service won't deliver mail ballots for states that don't hand over voter lists under plan for Trump directive from CNN.com, posted by Swampanky Dan, and that's a crosspost from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, if you want to mail in your ballot, and the state accepts that, that's fine. But ultimately, the state can justify nullifying your vote for whatever reason it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. It's why inherently, voting is a flawed system because votes are not going to be backed by force a lot of the time. So ultimately, I think libertarian position is you gotta get rid of voting altogether, because voting is just the means by which those in positions of authority legitimize themselves. And I think that's important to remember. Just because you mark down someone's name on a piece of paper doesn't give them authority to do whatever they want to. Just because they have a fancy title like president or senator doesn't give them the authority to do whatever they want to. And I think that's very much the libertarian position. Next, we have a DOJ brief prosperously insists that Trump's anti-weaponization phone is politically neutral from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I would disagree with that, but ultimately, if the government wants to justify what it wants to justify, oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. If the DOJ wants to make it politically neutral and is able to get away with it, oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it since they're in a position of government authority and you aren't. And then there was another post I wanted to share from the Libertarian Party USA subreddit I did. I said, libertarian perspectives on poaching endangered animals. I said, of all state regulations, I do think that some environmental regulations tend to be the most justified. With that being said, ultimately, poaching is just hunting without a license, kind of like how moonshining is brewing alcohol without a license. And as libertarian, I personally don't think the government should be telling you what you can and can't do. If you are intentionally poaching animals you know for a fact are endangered, I personally don't care for it and find it to be extremely scummy. But ultimately, it's not my position to tell you what you can and can't do when it comes to other life forms, especially ones that are not owned by anyone else. Thoughts? And one user said, Dead Seagulls replied, "Now makes sense to the ecosystem." I said, the argument could definitely be made, but at the same time, a lot of people do squish bugs there in their homes, which could be considered a violation of NAP as well if it does extend to the entire ecosystem. So ultimately, justify doing whatever you want to justify. If you want to justify hunting endangered animals, I personally don't think that's morally correct, but ultimately, a lot of libertarianism is you can't enforce your morality on others, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And it looks like we have another post. Peace President announces he will bomb and conquer Iran, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And that's a screenshot of truth from Donald Trump. The United States will be hitting Iran, whose Navy, Air Force, radar, aircraft, and all other forms of defense together for most of its offensive capability are gone. Very hard tonight. At some point in the not-too-distant future, we'll be taking Cargo Island and all other oil infrastructure points and assume total control of their oil and gas markets, much like we have Venezuela, which is working out brilliantly for both Venezuela and the United States of America. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump's constant warmongering with Iran, but, ultimately, he's in the position of government authority just by doing whatever he wants with the military, since the president is commander-in-chief of the military, and oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it, just because he has a fancy title like president, as I said earlier, doesn't mean he should be able to do whatever he wants, but oftentimes, that's how the state does work. When you have one of the fancy titles they give you, like president or senator, you can just, doing whatever you want to, and oftentimes, there's nothing that the peasants, like myself, can do about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.